let me start, since we have a lot of people from the investment community, let me start on this note. I believe we have now entered the end game for the second industrial revolution. This end game is going to roll out over the next 25 years. And every investment you make from here on in, on your watch, is going to be dependent on how we move from this end game to a new start. This end game has a trigger point, and that was July 2008. You remember that month? In 2008, oil hit 147 a barrel for Brent crude on world markets. That was a record. And when that happened, all the prices across the supply chain went through the roof. Because this entire civilization is made out of, as well as moved by, fossil fuels. Our fertilizers, our pesticides, our construction materials, most of our pharmaceutical products, our synthetic fiber, all made out of fossil fuels. And then there's our power, our transport, logistics, heat, and light. We have built a great short-lived civilization based on digging up the carbon deposits of a previous period in history. In fact, you know, I often muse if we do survive this moment, and I'm not being glib, if we do survive this moment as a species, I wonder what they'll think of us in 500,000 years from now. All of this will be gone. The pyramids, the skyscrapers, gone. The only record they'll have that we were here is our CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide footprint in the geological record. And you know what they're going to say? Back then, they were the fossil fuel people. We had the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. These people lived off fossil fuels and created a brilliant, exciting, short-lived, and dangerous civilization that almost took us to the end. So when oil started going over 100 a barrel in 2007, all the prices went up across the supply chain. At 120 a barrel, we had food riots in 22 countries because the price of wheat, barley, rye, and rice were doubling, tripling, and trebling, and 40% of the human race lives on $2 a day or less. And when those prices went up, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization put out an alert saying, we have the crisis of all crises. We have 1 billion people in harm's way right now. At 147 a barrel, all the purchasing power in the world shut down. People stopped buying groceries, pharmaceuticals, construction materials. It shut down. That was the economic earthquake. The collapse of the financial markets 60 days later, that was the aftershock. We're still dealing with the aftershock in public policy. We haven't gotten to the earthquake. And until we do, we can't begin to figure out how to get through this door to a new period in history. We now know in the business community, or at least we should know, investors, what the outer margins are of how far we can globalize the world on a second industrial revolution energy grid, technology grid, and infrastructure. It's between 125 and 150 a barrel. It's going to shut down every time. The reason is we've hit 2 milestones. Peak oil per capita in 1979. Now global peak oil production 2006 for crude oil. 1979, had we distributed all the crude oil that existed in that year to everyone alive at that moment of time and shared it, that's the most oil everyone could have. We have found more crude oil since then, but population goes a lot quicker. So if we distributed all the crude oil now to 7 billion people, there's just less to go around. Peak oil per capita. BP did the original study, uncontroversial. All the studies have verified. Peak oil. Now that's been controversial, as you know, among geologists, and I know you've taken a look at those studies. That's when we use half the crude oil up on the classic Hubert bell curve in geology. And what's interesting about that bell curve, when half the crude oil is used up, it's over, because we cannot afford the prices on the downside of that curve in the second half. The geologists have been arguing about when we peak on oil for 30 years. Then in 2011, the International Energy Agency dropped the bombshell for the investment community. Were we looking at it? And in their 2011 report, one paragraph in the IEA, which we all rely on for our forecasting, said it looks like we peaked on crude oil in 2006 at 70 million barrels a day. We're likely plateauing down at 69 million barrels a day, but listen to this. The IEA says it's going to cost us $8 trillion to get the remaining oil out. So when India and China and Southeast Asia made a bid to bring a third of the human race into the game at an 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12% growth rate over the last 15 years, at the last stages of a second industrial revolution, that aggregate demand pushing against the supply doesn't work. And we shut down in 2008. What I'm suggesting to you in the business community is this, and if you've been reading my columns on this, or I said it in the book a year ago, that we are now in 4-year cycles, 4 to 5 year cycles of growth collapse. 4-year cycles, 5, and we're in the second cycle right now. In 2009, oil went down to 30 a barrel because there was no economic activity. As soon as we started to replenish inventories in 2010, oil shot up, 94 a barrel before the Arab Spring, and this is key. The first quarter of 2012, oil hit another high, 124 a barrel. And Colgate-Palmolive and Unilever, the two major consumer products companies, you may remember this, issued their quarterly. And in that quarterly statement, they said profits are down first quarter 2012 because of the price of oil. We've embedded it in our products with an increased price, and consumer purchasing power is slowing down again. And I noticed we were just talking about chemicals. As you know, BASF said the same thing during that quarter. That affects everything from construction material to lubricants. We're heading toward the next slowdown. It's going on right now from China to the US. The ports are closing down. The inventories are not moving. There's no way to get through this wall of 125 to 150 a barrel. Now, there are other fossil fuels. We have tar sands in Canada, heavy oil in Venezuela. There's plenty of coal, and we've got shale gas. They're more expensive. They're more scarce. And they lead to the other crisis, which is now in real time, climate change. We are seeing the impacts on agriculture very dramatically. As I mentioned this morning, it's a change in the hydrological cycles. The water cycles are shifting, more bitter winter snows, prolonged dramatic floods in the spring, and very long droughts in the summer. And we're getting hit by agriculture in every region of the world, from Central Valley in California all the way to the beautiful agricultural land in southern France. It's happening everywhere. So what do we do? As I said this morning, we need a new economic vision for the world that's compelling and a game plan that's deliverable. And we've got to move to it quickly and lay down a new infrastructure for a new economic paradigm. And this morning I mentioned that the great economic revolutions occur in history when new energy regimes emerge and converge with communication revolutions to manage them, all through history. Today we are on the cusp of a new convergence of communication and energy, a third industrial revolution. And this third industrial revolution is being spearheaded in Germany. Absolutely in Germany. We had a very powerful communication revolution in the last 25 years. The personal computer and the internet. Now, what's so interesting about this communication revolution for someone like me? I'm sure I'm the oldest guy in the room. I grew up, I'm a war baby. Oh no, Dieter, you got me. Where are you? You've got me beat by a couple of years.
I'm watching you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You got me beat. We're the two oldest in the room. we grew up, on centralized electricity, one to many, centralized communication, radio, TV, newspapers, magazines, top-down, centralized. What's so interesting about the internet, it's completely different in its organizational pattern. It's organized to be distributed. It functions collaboratively, and it scales laterally. So now we have 2.3 billion human beings. This amazes me. We did this in 20 years, most of it. 2.3 billion people can now take a cell phone and a little desktop computer at almost no cost and send their own video, audio, and text, distributed, collaborative, peer-to-peer lateral power at the speed of light to each other with far more power than all the centralized television networks of the 20th century. We did this in 20 years. Now, for my generation, our generation, lateral power is a complete oxymoron. How can you have lateral power? From the great hydraulic civilizations all the way through the Second Industrial Revolution, with the exception of medieval Europe in the 15th and 16th century, which had water and wind power, we have organized, centralized, and we have assumed that power is pyramidal, right? Top down. But for the generation here in this room under the age of 40 that grew up on the internet, peer-to-peer, lateral power is second nature, and centralized power is archaic, old-fashioned, and makes no sense to them. This is the generational shift. It is really disruptive. This internet revolution is only half the story. Now the second half. What's happening now in Germany and Denmark, a few other, and scattered around Europe. This internet communication revolution, which is distributed, collaborative, and scales laterally, is just now beginning to merge with a new energy regime. Distributed energies, which have to be organized collaboratively and scale laterally. It's a perfect fit. What are distributed energies? Let me compare them to elite energies. Coal, oil, gas, shale gas, uranium are elite. Because the chances are, when you go home after this conference, those energies are not in your backyard. They're only found in a few places. They require huge military and geopolitical investments. I don't have to remind you here in Germany how many millions of people have died for coal and oil in 2 world wars. And these energies require massive capital to organize them from the wellhead and underground to the final end user, and require a vertically scaled, centralized civilization to make it all happen. These energies are fading, the technologies are old, the infrastructure is in disrepair. Now, what are distributed energies? Those are energies that are in our backyard, all the energy we'll ever need. The sun shines all over the world every day. 45 minutes of sunlight can power the global economy with ease for an entire year. The wind blows across this planet every single day, everywhere. Underneath the planet, we have a hot geothermal core of energy that can be converted overnight to our use. In the rural areas, we have agricultural and forestry waste that can be culled into energy instantaneously. On the coastal regions, our urban populations have the ocean tides and waves. They're dependable. They're coming in and out every day. Wherever we have garbage, we can convert it anaerobically back to energy. These distributed energies are found in every square inch of this biosphere in some frequency or proportion enough to provide for our little, strange little species until kingdom comes. The European Union has made a formal commitment to a 5-pillar infrastructure for a third industrial revolution. And from here on in, I want you to think investment, investment, investment. I was privileged to develop this plan with and for the EU. It was formally endorsed by the European Parliament in 2007. It's working its way through the European Commission. We're currently working with Vice President Tajani, the Vice President of the Commission, and the Industry Minister, and we are laying it out step by step. We had a conference last spring on growth, and in 2 weeks we will issue the next stage of this process. This has been going on for a long time now. Now we have to make it public. Pillar 1, the EU is committed formally, as you know, to 20% renewable energy by 2020. That's a mandate, not a suggestion. Every region has to get there. That's a third of the electricity of Europe. It's got to be green in 8 years from now. So this leads us to, how do we collect energies that are distributed and found everywhere? Pillar 2, how do we collect it? Now, our first thought was, well, look, we'll go to Italy and Greece and Spain. They've got a lot of sun. We'll put in some big solar parks and a high voltage electricity line. Maybe Enel will help us out. We'll just ship that electricity across Europe. Then we'll go to Ireland. They got all that offshore wind. We'll put in some big wind parks and ship it all off to Europe. The Norwegians got the hydro. Ship it. Let me say that none of us oppose these more concentrated uses of what are essentially distributed energies. They're easy, they're quick, they're low-lying fruits, they're not sufficient. There is no way in this God's earth we can manage a continental or global economy on concentrated wind, geothermal, and hydro parks. You can't build enough of them. There's not enough desert techs to pull this off. So this got us to thinking, if renewable energies are distributed and found everywhere, why are we only harvesting them in a few central points? And then it dawned on us, wake-up call, aha moment, we were using 20th century thinking based on fossil fuels and nuclear power. Centralize them and then send them to the end point, top down. So if these energies that are distributed are found everywhere, how do we collect them? Everywhere there's human infrastructure. Buildings, buildings, buildings. Buildings use the most energy. They create the most CO2 emissions. Parenthetically, the number 2 cause of industrial-induced climate change, which I always feel I have to mention because there's silence here, is beef production and consumption and animal husbandry. That's number 2. Number 3 is transport. Yet on number 2, not a single leader in 192 countries has made a single statement about the number 2 cause of climate change. How serious are we? Even Al Gore won't talk about it. Number 1 is buildings. We have 191 million buildings in the EU. Homes, offices, factories, barns, sheds. The goal is to convert every single building that exists now in Europe to your own personal green micro power plant. So you can get a little solar off the roof, the thin film, the panels, and now maybe the paint as we move the solar paint in. Get a little bit of wind vertically off the sidewalls. Get a little bit of geothermal heat from your heat pump under the ground. Catch that garbage and anaerobically digest it back into energy overnight, etc. The new buildings will be positive power. And it's a French construction company that created the most interesting invention of the second most interesting invention of the third industrial revolution, Martin and Olivier Bouygues. You know the Bouygues company. Olivier Bouygues showed me the blueprint for this building 3 years ago. I didn't think they'd pull it off. It went up right last year on time, right next to the OECD headquarters in Paris. Gorgeous office complex. It is so architecturally sophisticated, it sucks up enough sun alone, just the sun, to provide all of its needs and can send surplus back to the grid. And the ROI is 5 years, and they haven't even scaled. The ROI is going to get down to 3 years. Let me explain the importance of this building. The analogy here is 1970 mainframe computers. We had a few centralized mainframe computers and a few companies sharing information, centralized top down. This kid, Steve Jobs, comes along and he invents the personal computer. Today, 2 billion people create their own information, store it in digital, share it online, laterally around the world. Today, similarly, on the analogy, we have a few power and utility companies in every region of the world. They generate the power, they send it to us, we buy it. But already in Europe, because of the feed-in tariffs, we have several million buildings and locations producing their own green energy, some of it. Germany, Pillar 1, is now 20% green electricity and heading to 35% within 8 years. Pillar 2, Germany has converted 1 million buildings already to partial power plants and created 370,000 net jobs. This isn't academic. So in 10 years from now, we're going to have tens of millions of buildings around the world producing some of their own power, existing buildings. And the new positive power buildings are going to be mandated by law, especially for commercial purposes. In 20 years from now, we're going to have several hundred million buildings converted to power plants. This is going to be a transformation of habitat. The reason this is happening, it's following a similar cost curve as the shift from mainframe to desktop and cell phones. Not quite as fast, but it's exponential growth. Exponential growth catches you very quickly. So as we scale in these technologies for solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, biomass, they're going to get cheaper and cheaper, and they're going to be as cheap as cell phones in 20 years from now. Then you'll buy the service, and you'll get the harvesting technology free. And as they become cheaper and cheaper by scaling in laterally, then remember this, once those technologies have become dirt cheap, there's almost no marginal cost because the sun is free. It's not like coal, oil, gas, and uranium. The sun off your roof, it's free, take it. The wind off the side of your walls, marginal cost is nearly zero. Once the technology allows you to harvest it, it's free. The geothermal heat under the ground, it's free. Your garbage, there's plenty of that, free. So just as we democratized information with the internet, and once we put in the infrastructure and scaled it in, the marginal cost is nearly zero for each person then sharing and sending their own information, correct? Now we're going to be able to do that with buildings. So Steve Jobs creates the personal computer, Bouygues creates the positive power plant. But even with the older building stock, we're going to convert a lot of that. That's pillar 2, that's going to jumpstart the economy. If you want to jumpstart an economy, it's always about construction and infrastructure. It's going to take us 40 years to convert the building stock of this world, millions of jobs, thousands of small and medium-sized enterprise contractors, global companies, construction materials, conversion. So we have to put in the energy efficiencies and the retrofitting first. Then when we get the thermodynamic efficiencies tight and sealed, we put in the conversion. Millions of jobs. And the interesting thing about this is you don't wait to the end of the line. This is infrastructure. The moment you start, you create jobs day one, businesses day one, new productivity day one, income day one, and you can reliably know your return on investment as an investor because infrastructure, we can do the numbers. It's not like trying to run against a new application and hoping it'll take off. This is infrastructure. We know the returns. Pillar 3, that's the toughest pillar. Storage. The sun isn't always shining in Germany. Sometimes the wind's blowing at night and it's not cooperating because we need the electricity during the day. Water tables can be down because of climate drought, and then the hydroelectricity is a problem. We have to put in storage. We're in favor of every kind of storage. Flywheels, batteries, capacitors, water pumping, they're all good, bring them on. But at the center of storage, we put our focus on hydrogen for the simple reason it's the basic element of the universe. It's what we're made out of. It carries other energies. It's completely modular. You can put it in an apartment or in a big utility complex. Batteries can't take that load. The EU's committed 8 billion euros to a public-private deployment of hydrogen. So the way it works, if you've got a small office building, got a solar panels up there on the roof or a thin film, you get a little green electricity, and if you have some surplus you're not using at the moment, put the surplus electricity in water, just like high school chemistry class. The hydrogen comes out of the H2O into a tank. When the sun isn't shining on your roof, you simply convert that hydrogen in a fuel cell back to electricity. It stores energy like digital stores media. And if you're engineers here, do we have any engineers? Any engineers? You know, of course you can't escape the second law of thermodynamics. There's always an energy loss. But this is a tiny energy loss in conversion compared to bringing nuclear, coal, oil, and gas at every step of convergence from the wellhead to the end user. This is right at the end of the line.
And you have to waste heat at home.
And that's right. And I was going to. And you can take the waste heat and put it back. Actually, thank you for saying that. I should have. Pillar 4. This is where the communication revolution of the internet converges with the new energies to create a nervous system for the new infrastructure. We're going to take off-the-shelf internet technology, and we're going to convert the power and transmission grid of Europe to an energy internet, a distributed smart grid. If you hear smart grid, you heard the wrong word, because that means that the big energy companies want to put in an advanced meter and control it from headquarters. This is an energy internet, a distributed smart grid. And so when millions and millions of buildings are harvesting just a little bit of their own energy at a given moment, storing it in hydrogen like we store media and digital, and then if you don't need some of it during the day or the week or the month, your software can direct you to sell your energy on an energy internet from the Irish Sea to the doorsteps of Russia, just like we create information, store it in digital, share it online. I was just with Rennie Oberman for 3 days in June at Deutsche Telekom, and they are testing the smart grid, as you may know, in 6 regions of Germany right now. And E.ON is working with Hydrogenics in my group out of Canada, and they're testing the storage across the utility complex right now. Pillar 5, that's the last pillar, logistics and transport. Electric vehicles are here. We're going into mass production of fuel cell cars, trucks, and buses in 2014-15. This is a done deal by the 6 majors. This isn't going to be changed. Be able to plug in your vehicles anywhere in the infrastructure and get green electricity. And wherever we travel, a plug everywhere in every parking space. You can plug in, get green electricity, or let's say you're working, your car's computer's monitoring the grid, and if the electricity price goes up, your software can be programmed to sell your electricity back to the grid. These 5 pillars alone are nothing. If you're going to invest in the components, you're going to waste your money. Alone, these are nothing but components. It's only when we connect these 5 pillars, it's the synergies between them that creates a mega technology platform for a completely new economy and a completely new business model, which we'll discuss in a minute. The reason I say this, do not in Europe make the mistake that President Obama made. He made what could be a fatal mistake for the future of the U.S. economy. I voted for this president. I'll vote for him again, but he lost it. He wanted a green economy. He talks about a green economy. There is no green economy, and the reason is the president invested in billions and billions of dollars of U.S. stimulus tax money on standalone, siloed, piloted little projects. A battery factory in one state, a solar panel factory in another state, completely unconnected. He failed to understand that the great economic revolutions bring communication energy matrices together and create infrastructure. Example, second industrial revolution. It wasn't enough for Daimler and Benz to create the internal combustion engine. Then we had to lay out the oil and pipelines at the same time. Then we had to lay out the autobahns and the highways. Then we had to amortize and incentivize suburban construction across the interstates so we could disperse commercial and residential patterns of living. Then we had to put in centralized electricity to get the telephone to the rural areas for suburbs so that we could have commerce and trade with good communications. We did it all at the same time. It's called infrastructure. We learned this the hard way in the EU. Let me talk about the hard way. As you know, we put in feed-in tariffs across the EU. So that means the electricity price goes up slightly. You don't really notice it. Early adopters can convert their buildings and get premium for sending electricity back to the grid. Well, guess what? Pillar 1 has been successful. We're scaling in so fast we can pare down the subsidy as fast as we scale in, like Germany. But what's happened is we now have several million players trying to get green electricity back to the power grid. The power grid isn't designed for several million players. It's 60 years old, servo-mechanical, and is designed to go in one direction. You cannot actually handle peak and base loads and manage millions of players. So we moved Pillar 1, renewables, but we haven't moved Pillar 4, the energy internet, quick enough. Then Pillar 1 has been so successful, the renewables, we've got regions in Europe now that are 40, 50, 60% green, renewable energy. Navarre and Aragon, Spain, 70%. Guess what? We're losing 3 out of 4 kilowatts because we didn't put in Pillar 3 storage. The wind's blowing at the wrong time. In Sicily a few weeks ago at high noon, there was so much radiance from the sunlight, we went to negative price on the grid. And 12 hours later, the whole grid went through the roof again because there was nothing going on. We didn't put in storage. And now Daimler's in my group, Dr. Zessis, they're scared to death, and GM in our group, they're scared to death. Because they're coming out and spending billions on the electric and fuel cell vehicles, and if we don't have an infrastructure phasing in over the next several years, that new development of cars post-carbon is orphaned out. Got to put it all together. Together, these 5 pillars is a new paradigm. The third industrial revolution is power to the people, literally and figuratively. The music companies, I gotta say, they didn't understand lateral power. I watched this unfold. I teach at the Wharton School in the executive ed. We bring in a lot of CEOs. I watched this in the music industry. When millions of kids started file sharing music laterally, the music companies thought it was a joke. Then they became terrified. Then they went out of business in 5 years. It was quick. And the newspapers, they simply did not see the blogosphere coming. Now the newspapers are going out of business very quickly, or trying to create blogs and figuring out how do you make money with near zero marginal costs. Haven't figured it out yet. As powerful as this democratization of information is, when the IT and internet technology then manages the new renewable distributed energies and the cost comes down to near zero, that's the second half of this revolution. It truly is power of the people. And when this five-pillar infrastructure phases in the nodes, it allows us to have new business models that can embed themselves in a completely new infrastructure with dramatic productivity. Let me give you an example of the kinds of processes. 3D printing. 3D printing is a third industrial revolution business nestled inside a third industrial revolution infrastructure. It's not a second industrial revolution business. Now, all of you know 3D printing. For some that don't, we now can take software in a printer. The software can direct molten plastic or metal to melt, and layer by layer the software allows the product to build up a three-dimensional physical product with movable parts, and it pops out of the printer. It's like magic. We got 200 companies doing it. A lot of it's open source. And right now the projections are it's moving more quickly than the internet did in 1990, the Internet of Things. Now, what this means, if you're a mini manufacturer anywhere in the world, you can be in Senegal, southern France, Vietnam, you can, with open source, code for a product, and because this is additive manufacturing, you can outcompete centralized global factories in China or anywhere else. What I mean is this. I have taught for years business leaders subtractive manufacturing. You have a big centralized factory, you take a hunk of material, you winnow it down, pare it down, cut it down, and then you connect the final product, and you waste a lot during the process, thermodynamically. It's like French cooking, very wasteful, but you enjoy the final product. With additive manufacturing, the software is directing each layer step by step to build up and only uses 1/10 of the materials. Then if your mini manufacturer is powering their factory locally with green electricity from their producer cooperative, their regional high-tech park, they're not on the world market to power their factory with oil and nuclear power. And then how do you market your product if you're a mini manufacturer? In the first and second industrial revolution, you had to have a lot of money to market. TV, radio, advertising, global reach. Scaled, centralized, right? With the internet and the third industrial revolution infrastructure, your marketing costs are near zero. Do you know, how many know the site Etsy? Etsy. E-T-S-Y. No one knows this site? The young people know it. All right, this kid was a New York University dropout. He wanted to build craft furniture in his apartment in Brooklyn. All right? His parents must have been pretty upset. He dropped out of school. So the kid builds all this furniture, and it's overwhelming his apartment because he didn't figure out how to sell it. So he got together with two other guys, and they created an internet site called Etsy. 7 years later, there are 900,000 craft producers freely advertising on this site from the most remote regions of the world. 49 million consumers are inhabiting that site. They find the producer they want to buy from, and the only money transferred is a tiny, tiny commission to Etsy in the sale. And guess what? Those tiny commissions ended up to be $600 million last year. The young man called me out of nowhere a year ago. Mr. Young Kalen is his name. He said, "What do I do now?" And I said, "I can't help you. You can retire. You don't need any advice whatsoever. I probably need your advice." So now, if you're a mini manufacturer, you are developing material with open source technology products, 1/10 of the materials. You're powering it locally with your producer co-ops producing the energy. You're marketing it on internet sites with almost zero marginal cost. And your logistics for local and regional markets is all powered by your green transport. This is only one aspect of the new business model, but it democratizes information, energy, manufacturing, marketing, logistics, and in the book, which I think you have copies of, you'll see many other examples in the services and the financial areas. As we embed the new business model into this third industrial revolution infrastructure, it takes off. Let me say this to all the investors here. The name of the game for the next 25 years during this end game, with the volatile price of the old energies completely scaring markets every 4 years. And as we spend the next 25 years scaling up the new energies and technologies and infrastructure, in this very dramatic moment, these 20 years, whether any company succeeds or fails, including the ones you invest in, will not depend on their labor cost. Labor is becoming a smaller and smaller part of the production process everywhere because of automation. I wrote a book on it called The End of Work. Some of you may have read years ago. This is happening around the world, from manufacturing to the services. So to the extent that a company succeeds or fails, or an industry, or a country's economy, will depend on their energy costs, embedded in their products, because as the former speaker said, chemistry, everything, biology, it's all embedded energy. Construction materials, pharmaceutical products, fertilizers, everything. Now I'm going to share with you, I'm going to share a dirty little secret with you, and you spread it. No economist wants me to talk about this because they're ashamed, and I'm going to tell you about it. There's a little secret in economic theory that you probably don't know about. When Robert Solow won the Nobel Prize on growth theory, he let the cat out of the bag. He said, we used to believe that the key to productivity is capital per worker. And of course, the reason we believe that is we have a fetish with capitalism. We love capital. Put enough capital per worker, increase productivity. But he said when we monitor the industrial age, we find out that capital per worker only accounts for about 14% of all the productivity. So then Mr. Solow said, well, where did the other 86% of the productivity come from? He said, we don't know. Can you imagine that? The economists don't know. We know now, 25 years later. Robert Ayers at INSEAD, John Skip Leitner and my team, many others have done studies. It's clear. The other 86% of the productivity comes from thermodynamic efficiencies. Now, this seems so obvious now. Why didn't the economists see this? Because, as I said this morning, they rely on Newtonian physics. So their metaphors are about actions and reactions, supply and demand curves. Thermodynamics is what economic activity is about, and that's all about thermodynamic efficiencies and productivity. So every chemist, every biologist, every architect, and every engineer understands this. The economists didn't. So how does this relate to our investments in the future? Let me give you an example of a new business model. When we rolled this idea out in Europe, the power and utility companies were not happy. The energy companies, of course, were not happy at all. But the power and utility companies, they were befuddled. They said, we don't want this. We like to generate power, distribute it, and sell electricity. What we have said to the CEOs, and I've met with almost all of them, is this, and many of them are coming our way now in Europe, as you know. They're in two portfolios, second and third industrial revolution. Some are holding out, and you know the companies that are holding out. We said, look, get used to it. We have several million people producing their own energy now in Europe. And in 10 years from now, tens of millions in the world. And in 25 years from now, hundreds of millions of people through producer co-ops and SME networks, tech parks. They're all going to produce their own energy. It's going just like computers and desktops. So we'll sell you the energy. You, the utility company, you run the energy internet. And the way you'll make money in the third industrial revolution as a power company is by selling as little electricity as you can sell. And then they really get confused. And we give them the IBM case study, which you know is a cliche in every MBA class. In the 1990s, Lou Gerstner was in trouble. The IBM computer had no margins left. It was their cash cow. But everyone had the same computer. The Chinese, the Koreans, the Indians, the Japanese, and big anonymous companies were putting them all out and putting their logo on. So Gerstner realized they were in trouble. So they went into deep retreat at IBM and they asked, what do we need, what does the world need from us that we can sell them? And it's not computers. It's managing information. So now IBM and Cisco and HP, they manage information flows of clients, and everyone has a chief information officer. What we're saying to the power and utility companies, your real expertise is not selling electrons, it's managing energy. To the extent that you can run the energy internet and then set up thousands of partnerships with small, medium, and large-sized companies, you manage their energy flows with them. and they'll have a chief productivity officer. And to the extent you can reduce their energy needs embedded in their products, because physical materials are made of energy, to the extent that you can reduce their energy needs, increase their thermodynamic efficiencies, dramatic increase in productivity. Then you contract with them to share their productivity gains back with you. It's called shared savings agreements. Far more money to be made here than in selling electrons. Some utility companies won't make the move, and already we have new startups. The big companies, GDS Suez, I was just with them, they're creating an ESCO. Schneider Electric has an ESCO. And now startups are creating ESCOs, energy service companies. They don't need the utility companies. They're bringing together people with energy expertise in construction and logistics and IT expertise, and then they're going out and finding clients. In the last 12 months this has started, and then they're managing their energy flows, sharing their productivity, and they're selling it back to the utilities. They don't need the utilities. This is another one of the many business models emerging. Now let me explain here that the first and second industrial revolution, because it scaled vertically, elite energies, centralized electricity communication required lots of capital. So you had to have centralized factories, logistics, transport, top down. The third industrial revolution, because it scales laterally, comes in differently. The first and second industrial revolution favored national markets and national governments. That was its reach. The third industrial revolution, I'm taking some water. The third industrial revolution scales laterally, and it comes in like Wi-Fi. Think investments here. It comes in like Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi was very improbable. Somebody discovered the garbage frequency on their garage, and then they shared it with the next guy's garage. In 5 years, entire continents were hotspots. The third industrial revolution comes in just like Wi-Fi. It does not respect borders. It goes building to building, region to region, node to node, until it reaches the ocean edge. It crosses continents. So, for example, if Lyon, France, for example, is setting up a node, it's starting to create businesses, new jobs, day one, by infrastructure shift. As soon as it starts to set up that node, it's got to find other nodes like Wi-Fi. Because if Lyon has a surplus of sun because they had a good day or the wind was blowing and they had a lot of water because of rain for hydro, they want to sell surplus to some other zone or node somewhere on the continent. If it's nighttime in one time zone across the continent, they want to sell their wind to a daytime zone, or solar to a nighttime zone, or agricultural waste in one region to another region. The third industrial revolution is not decentralized, it's distributed. It favors millions and millions of small players using grid IT 2.0, and when millions of small players share small amounts across continents, it overwhelms little centralized nuclear and coal-fired power plants, just like in the music industry and the blogosphere. It's called grid IT 2.0. So the third industrial revolution favors continental markets. Where we're headed here is we globalize the third industrial revolution not top-down but bottom-out. That means the globalization is going to take place through continentalization. Continentalization. We're heading to continental markets and continental political unions to regulate those markets. The European Union is ideally positioned here to lead this, but it may not. And that is, the EU has 500 million consumers and another 500 million consumers in the partnership regions in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Gulf. That's 1 billion people. Our goal, and we're going to lay this out in the next stage of our industry communique in October, I'll give you a little brief update on it. Our goal is now to feed the golden goose. We have a 1 billion person potential market. What we need to do is lay out this entire nodal infrastructure across Europe and into the partnership regions so that 1 billion people have broadband communication, internet technology, managing an energy internet, and plug-in transport and logistics at very low marginal cost so that 1 billion people can engage in commerce and trade off carbon. Off carbon, not low carbon. China, in the last 3 months, has moved aggressively. The book came out in China on the 1st of June. We were all surprised. The leadership has taken it up at the Politburo. Huge discussion, if you Google it up, going on in China about this. And they're trying to figure out how they fit in the Asian Union with ASEAN. And so is Japan and Korea and India trying to figure out how do they fit into the ASEAN Union, because they're moving to a continental market in Asia. And the African Union was stumbling until the EU put in a lot of money to start moving third industrial revolution infrastructure. And now they're talking about a continental market, as you know, in Africa, or regional parts of a continental market with third industrial revolution infrastructure. South American Union formed 3 years ago, just beginning, but you're going to see a continental market from Mexico to Chile, and probably a continental political union. My big fear is the US and Canada. I'm very, very worried. Because what's happened here is, ironically, it was Americans who created the first half of the third industrial revolution, the internet, personal computer. Then we stopped coal and didn't close the deal. And instead of joining that with the new energies, distributed energies, we're going back to shale gas and tar sands and coal. And if we lock ourselves in 20th century centralized energies, there's no multiplier effect, there's no new productivity gains, and we continue to put the CO2 out there. And Canada and the US, I'm telling you, could be a second-tier countries in less than 30 years, locked in to this infrastructure. It's a dangerous moment. My hope is that California, Oregon, and Washington will wake up the rest of the country in parts of New England, and Austin to San Antonio. I don't know if it's going to happen. So let me finish with this. I think that this economic plan is not rocket science. My wife was very brutal about this about a year ago. She was tough. She said, it took you folks 20 years to come up with these 5 pillars. 20 years, she said. She said, obviously we have to get off fossil fuels and nuclear. So what's left? All the energies that bathe the earth, they're distributed, they're renewable. We know this. That's where we have to go. She said, of course, since they're everywhere, you have to collect them, so you'd use your infrastructure to harvest them, your buildings. That's simple. Then she said, we know they're intermittent, so you got to store them, so you got to put in hydrogen and other storage. And she said, well, obviously, you can't do it alone. You have to share the energy so that you can run global economy, so you'd put in an energy internet, and then you'd plug it into your transport. She said it took you 20 years to do this. 20 years, lots of people. This game plan is pragmatic. It's common sense. If there's a plan B, I don't have a clue what it is. We have 120 companies. We're starting to lay down master plans for cities and regions, and now countries are asking. There's some good companies in there. It's Acciona and Bouygues and Cisco and Philips and IBM and the great architectural firms. We're learning as we go. And we're beginning to see the possibility of regions beginning to lay down these nodes. But I guess what I'd say here at the end is that even with a good game plan, and this is common sense, this can get us off carbon, this can be exponential. I don't know if we'll get there in time. History's mercurial. You can have catastrophic accidents, bad decisions, a generation that goes the other way, and just bad luck. But this time around, the human race doesn't have the luxury of any of those. Because if our scientists are right, we're racing against the clock here. We're in real-time climate change. We don't even know if it's too late now. It's moving quicker than we thought, much quicker. So we'd have to be on page, move this investment, lay down this infrastructure, and we can't make any mistakes. We can't lock ourselves into old infrastructure, and we have to hope that we have good luck and no bad decision making. But even with this, what's missing here, we have to change consciousness along with this. We have to shift from geopolitical consciousness to biosphere consciousness in one generation. I'm guardedly hopeful here. How many of you have children? So I bet your children are coming home. This is really interesting. My wife and I don't have children, so we get this from other folks, and it's kind of funny, but very serious. We've got kids all over the world coming home now with biosphere consciousness, 12-year-old kids, and this has all happened in less than 8 years. Less than 8 years. This is a transformational shift. The kids are coming home, and they're saying to Daddy, why are you using so much water while you're shaving? Or they're saying to Mom and Dad, why is the red light on the TV? We're not even watching it. Or why do we have 2 cars? Why don't we do one in car share? Or this is the one I particularly like, dear to me. We're getting so many kids coming home and asking, where did the steak or hamburger come from on my plate? Really. Kids all over the world are saying, did this come from a rainforest? Did they have to destroy the tree canopies for 4 little inches of topsoil to graze the cow for my hamburger? And when they destroyed the tree, the kids are actually saying, what happened to all the plant and animal life in the tree canopy? Did it go extinct? And if there's no trees to absorb CO2, the kids are saying, Doesn't that mean the temperature on Earth goes up? There's no sink to absorb the CO2. Does that mean some farmer somewhere in the world is having floods and droughts and can't feed his kids because of the hamburger on my plate? What these kids are learning in the developing world and the developed world is ecological footprint. The best thing about the carbon market was not the carbon market, it was ecological footprint. We created a new anthropology here. The kids are learning that everything they do, everything that every species do, including plants and animals, has an ecological footprint that affects the well-being of some other creature, some other ecosystem in the world, correct? The kids are connecting the dots. They're thinking as part of a biosphere community. We've got millions of kids Skyping in classrooms around the world. They're on Facebook. And now with renewable energies, they're going to create and share energies across continents. They're beginning to think beyond blood ties and religious affiliation and national identity. They're not losing them, but they're starting to think as human beings. That's what biosphere consciousness and ecological footprint's about. And they're beginning to realize that our fellow creatures are part of the family. They're beginning to realize the biosphere is our indivisible community. So I'm guardedly hopeful. But here's what I think the mission is in this room, in the investment community. You are the ones that are really committed. That's why you're here. You're the front line. I know this. You're a small part of the investment community. You're the ones that are trying to say to your colleagues, it's time to wake up and do all this. I understand that. We have here the front line. But what we need to do now is take all of our individual initiatives and put them inside a bigger narrative. Because otherwise we're going to end up with little test pilot shots and little isolated projects till the end of the world. And you might make a little return on your investment, but you cannot invest in the future with isolated projects. What we need is the investment community to take all these independent initiatives and embellish them with this new narrative, so we lay down an infrastructure for a completely new economic paradigm. So I would say the mission here in the investment community, private equity, pension funds, the banks, move the narrative. Then invest in those synergies that help lay down the infrastructure for all those components. Then we end up with a new economic paradigm that dramatically increases productivity, puts people to work for the next 40 years, and lowers the temperature on the planet at the same time. Then when we look at reducing CO2, it's not a punishment, it's a mark of our success. Because the less CO2, the greater our productivity. The greater our productivity, because we've been thermodynamically efficient. So my hope here is that with this group here, and with all your folks you know, we're all six points removed from each other, move this narrative, move the investments, help us with government at the local, regional, national level on investing in the infrastructure that can take us into a post-carbon era. And the legacy you will leave is really far more than the bottom line. I suspect most of you are in this not just for the bottom line. You're in this because you really believe you have something to give to the world, and that is to make this a better place for the kids and all the other creatures here. The legacy you will leave is you can say that on your watch, we completely transitioned the investments of this planet so we could lay down a paradigm that's sustainable and just and worthy of life on this earth. I don't know of a generation of investors that could leave that kind of legacy. It's on your watch. So we're counting on you.